Welcome back to another episode of the AI Policy Podcast. This week, we're talking about the U.S. AI Safety Institute rebrand, a recent congressional hearing on AI and export controls, and Meta's new so-called Superintelligence Lab, which is very interesting. Greg, welcome. As always, so good to have you here. Let's talk U.S. AI Safety Institute. It's been rebranded as the Center for AI Standards and Innovation. On June 3rd, the Department of Commerce released a statement announcing several changes to the U.S. AI Safety Institute. One of the main changes was a new name. So before we get into the details of the statement, can you provide us with a refresher on what the original AI Safety Institute is and what it's meant to do?
Yeah, it's kind of weird to say, but this organization is coming up on 2 years old at this point.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, so its origins are in the UK AI Safety Summit, which happened in November 2023. And then shortly after that, at that summit, then Vice President Harris announced that they were going to create one. They created one in miniature pretty quickly. And now this organization has been going and, releasing guidance, doing other kinds of things. And one of the interesting points here is that it was set up in NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So standards has always been a part of its mission.
Our favorite building out 270.
Yeah. Its mission has always been connected to standards. So in that first fact sheet, they said that one of the things the AI Safety Institute was going to take over responsibility for was NIST's AI risk management framework, which was a framework, for companies or other organizations developing or using AI, to assess their risk and manage it properly on an organizational basis. And that has continued at the AI Safety Institute. And what's interesting is now with this new rebrand, they're taking the word safety out and they're putting the word standards back in. So it's always had a standards kind of mission, but now they're putting that front and center. And then there's a bunch of other changes as well.
Okay, so with the new name and direction, what parts of the original institute are sticking around and what do you expect to change?
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out, that you and I have talked about this a bunch, how in Republican politics, really since January 6th, 2021, the word safety has not been a favored term for any kind of reason, right? It's been a very controversial term in Republican political circles. And so I think it's been clear to a lot of folks for a long time, as soon as Donald Trump won the November 2024 election, that if the AI Safety Institute was going to survive, it was definitely at a minimum going to have a name change, because in some pockets of conservative politics, safety really has a connotation and an association with social media censorship. And so while there's ideas behind, safety that Republicans were on board with, they certainly were not on board with that term. And you can see that thinking reflected in the quote from the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, where he said, quote, "For far too long, censorship and regulations have been used under the guise of national security. Innovators will no longer be limited by these standards. CASI, no longer AC, will evaluate and enhance U.S. innovation of these rapidly developing commercial AI systems while ensuring they remain secure to our national security standards." So that's one change, is just the overall framing. The second thing I want to point out is that the definition of risk has narrowed. And this is actually echoing what already happened with the UK AI Safety Institute. They rebranded even before the US one did as the AI Security Institute for the exact same reason, right? They just didn't want the connotations of safety. So in this case, per the statement, that the Commerce Department put out, quote, "CASI will focus on demonstrable risks such as cybersecurity, biosecurity, and chemical weapons." And if you contrast that to what, for example, the AI risk management framework said several years ago, quote, "AI technologies pose risks that can negatively impact individuals, groups, organizations, communities, society, the environment, and the planet." So this is really a narrowing of focus to really explicit and concrete national security type focuses. Now, it's worth pointing out that a lot of that narrowing had sort of already taken place after the election. I don't really think there was significant work going on, for example, mitigating bias and discrimination in AI models going on at the AI Safety Institute. But this just formalizes it and makes it crystal clear. this institution has two mandates. One is on innovation and helping U.S. industry succeed. And the second is on national security. And then leadership on standards is sort of the means to both of those ends.
Okay. So we expect great things out of this institute. How safe are they going to, without getting into, names and calling labels and all that, is safety really still a priority?
Yeah, and I think when you talk about safety, obviously there's multiple ways that you can use that word, right? One is thinking about harms, like safety from harms like bias and discrimination. They're just not interested in that category of safety anymore. And the kind of risks that they're focused on mitigating are ones that we have a paper coming out on this in not too long, right? Which is what if AI systems can lower the barriers to entry for certain categories of malicious activity, right? We think of developing a bioweapon as something that would require a nation state or a pretty well-resourced terrorist group, or at an absolute minimum, an evil genius, right?
Yeah.
And
these are the kinds of things that keep AI people like you and me also up at night, because AI is so smart, it's getting smarter by the second. And if it can develop a bioweapon or another kind of weapon of mass destruction, look out, right? I mean,
exactly. So what you really don't want is, you don't want AI to be so smart that it takes, developing a bioweapon or developing chemical weapons from being, only within reach of a well-resourced evil genius, and put it within reach of an evil moron, not an evil genius. Like, that's the kind of risk factor that we're thinking about. And I think one of the ways that standards can be useful to that is, you've got a lot of organizations that do care about AI safety. I mean, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, all of them talk about the national security risks that Casey has been talking about. And they've been talking about it even before the government moved on these types of issues. But those are extremely well-resourced, well-financed corporations, who can independently decide to invest in these security risk type issues and mitigating them. The question is, like, what about this universe of AI startups? What about the open source community? What can they draw upon? And so the idea behind Casey is, instead of just lowering the barriers to entry for bad guys, something that we don't want, how do we lower the barriers to entry for good behavior? How do we sort of give companies a totally viable playbook that is grounded in the best technical expertise worldwide, that is grounded in best practices, where companies can share this information with the government in a way that they feel like is not going to put them at a competitive disadvantage? And how do they put all of that into practice to again, lower the barriers to entry, this time to good behavior? And so that kind of standards thing is there. Now, one thing I do kind of have in the back of my mind is just what is going to be included in this pro-innovation part of the story. So we talked about
right, because let's face it, nobody, whether it's a startup or a nation state, is trying to slow down artificial intelligence. Everybody.
There was a community that was advocating for that.
There's communities.
They're really outside of policymaking at this point. Like, they're not really a part of the conversation.
Nobody in policymaking really, because of our competition with China, because of industry competition, because of research competition. Nobody is trying to slow down AI, but guardrails like this around bad actors are super important. That's why we have a podcast.
Right, and you can imagine that there is a mechanism for these types of security and standards to actually accelerate adoption, right? If you think about the caution that companies have, or the concern that customers might have in adopting these kinds of technologies, that concern can slow adoption. So to the extent that there is some kind of a government stamp of approval of what constitutes best practices for safety, security, that sort of thing, if that's widely known, if that's widely disseminated, if American brands have that kind of reputation and connotation that can give customers peace of mind, then that can actually accelerate adoption. I mean, you saw that in other general purpose technologies like electricity. Electricity started getting adopted way, way faster when the risk of fire went way, way down. And can there be sort of a replicating of that story when it comes to AI standards? And I think that's what Casey is going to focus on the innovation side of the equation.
That's a really good way of looking at it. When you look to electricity and its development and its widespread use, we forget that starting fires was a big part of it at the very beginning. It's
I mean, like if you put a candle next to a light bulb and then you walk out and the building burns down, right? Everybody's going to blame the candle today. But in 1890, that was not at all clear cut, right? Like both of them were totally at risk of starting
a fire. Well, it just puts this innovation into a bit of context, and I appreciate you doing that, Greg. Let's move on and talk about the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. This is your favorite government entity, I believe.
Yeah, it's certainly up there. Yeah,
it's up there. So the House Foreign Affairs South and Central Asia Subcommittee recently held a hearing with Undersecretary Jeffrey Kessler, the top official of the Bureau of Industry and Security, also known as BIS. The hearing was entitled Bureau of Industry and Security FY26 Budget, Export Controls, and the AI Arms Race, and it included extensive discussion of AI chip export controls. We've discussed the BIS on this podcast many times before. Can you remind us of their role in AI policy?
Sure. So to begin, you might wonder, like, why was this happening in the South and Central Asia subcommittee?
That's my question for sure.
Yeah. For whatever reason, that is the subcommittee on House Foreign Affairs with responsibility for dual-use export controls and oversight of BIS. So this is the right place to be having this conversation. And BIS has been at the center of U.S.-China AI competition because of the AI chip export controls and the associated controls on things like semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So BIS has been in the hot seat for years now on the AI topic, and this hearing really just put it point blank. Like, we want to talk to you about export controls and their connection to the AI arms race. Now, we've gotten statements, from the Trump administration. They put out a statement when they repealed, for example, the Biden administration's AI diffusion rule. We got statements, when they banned the export of NVIDIA's H20 chips to China. And this hearing, I think, was like kind of the first opportunity since those big muscle movements for BIS's leadership, now Kessler as the undersecretary, to sort of explain what is your grand unified theory of export controls. Because you can point to various moves by the Trump administration where here it looks like we're loosening export controls by selling more chips to, for example, Gulf states such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia and getting rid of the diffusion rule. Other places, it looks like we're tightening export controls by banning the H20. And so this was the opportunity for the Trump administration, personified by Kessler, to sort of explain, here is what we're trying to accomplish. Here is how you connect the dots between all of our various actions.
Okay, so were there any specific comments, either by the members themselves or by Undersecretary Kessler, that really stood out to you during his testimony?
Sure. I mean, there was a bunch. I thought it was a really worthwhile and meaningful and meaty testimony. So one of the first things that Kessler said, and this was in his opening statement, was the importance of fulfilling President Trump's skinny budget request as it pertains to BIS. He wanted $303 million in funding for BIS, which is about 50% budget increase for BIS. So I've been screaming for this for years.
You have.
And the Trump administration finally requested it. Kessler has actually now put numbers on what that would translate into in terms of additional capacity. So for domestic enforcement, that would be 200 export enforcement special agents across the United States. And then the overseas contingent of enforcement officials would go from 12 to 30. That's a really big increase in the overall manpower and this is a law enforcement agency, prosecuting these cases against this kind of criminal activity and detecting criminal activity. One other thing is interesting is they want to bring in more specialized engineers and technical experts. So when we talk about export controls, if it's an item-based control, that's really tied to sometimes very nitty-gritty technical specifications, right? Like, are you laying down, 5 nanometer copper wire, for example? And so if you have like a special agent, somebody with a gun and a badge, this individual, it might not be obvious to them, right? Like, how do you tell when a machine is or is not involved in like 5 nanometer copper wire laydown? So I think this is BIS acknowledging that for certain areas, they do need in-house technical experts who can kind of go toe-to-toe with industry and not, take their word for it, know what to look for, know how to assess documents that are obtained under subpoena. And I think that's just a wonderful thing. Now, one other thing I think here is just like, that's the technical expertise. There's also the technical enabling capacity, right? BIS is overseeing like trillions of dollars in trade activity. A lot of that, shows up in these databases, and you want those different databases to talk to each other in a way that connects the dots, right? You don't want the answer to be somewhere there lurking in a PDF, right, that nobody even knows to go read. You want these databases to sort of say like, hey, this license application is coming from this company, but actually that company's secret owner via a shell company is this other company, right? And you want as much of that to be automated and surfaced to the analyst in a way that is rapid and well sourced. So I hope and expect that some of this money is going to go not just to hiring more people, but to giving these people more technical tools to make them more productive, to make them more effective. A couple other things that came out in this testimony from Kessler. The first official statement from BIS, their internal projection of Huawei's AI chip production capacity. So this is the Ascend chip product line. And Kessler said, quote, Huawei's Ascend chip production capacity for 2025 will be at or below 200,000. We project that most or all of that will be delivered to companies in China. So what's really interesting here is my assessment is actually that they could make more than that. The reason why they would not make more than that is the Ascend chips come off the 7 nanometer wafer production line. And the 7 nanometer wafer production line can also be used to make phone chips. It can also be used to make laptop chips. So it's kind of a choice that Huawei has to make strategically. How much of that wafer production capacity do we want to allocate to AI chips, given the defect rate, customers' interest in actually buying these things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then there's a second quote from Kessler that I thought was great, which was, quote, we shouldn't take too much comfort from that fact. China is investing huge amounts to increase its AI chip production, as well as the capabilities of the chips it produces. China is catching up quickly. So I certainly agree there. And I think one way to think about this is that, as NVIDIA keeps moving forward with the state of global chip design and the state of global chip manufacturing, right, they're going to go from 4 nanometers to 3 nanometers to 2 nanometers to 1 nanometers. Like, all of that is going to deliver performance improvement. They're going to go from great to greater and even greater in terms of performance. But Huawei is arguably going to be making a more strategic transition, which is from what is effectively a non-viable chip, the Ascend 910B. It just doesn't work reliably enough, or is even, an acceptable choice for a lot of the applications that are most important to AI right now, like large language models. That's why they have so many of these chips in China, and they're in data centers where nobody uses them. So while NVIDIA is going to go from the best chip in the world to an even more amazing chip, Huawei is going to go from a chip that literally no one wants because it doesn't work to a chip that maybe is still nowhere near as good as NVIDIA, but at least it works. And I think that sort of off-on kind of transition actually really matters strategically. And so I think, the problems that Huawei has with their Ascend 910B line, their Ascend 910C line, with their surrounding software ecosystem, I do expect them to make progress on all of these things. And that is going to be strategically meaningful. And BIS is acknowledging that. And I think that's completely fair.
So what does all of this mean for China's, grand AI ambitions?
Well, I think one thing here is that we do have statements from BIS that indicates that they really care about this policy, AI chip export controls. They're bringing on more enforcement capacity. At least they're requesting Congress give them more enforcement capacity. They're openly talking about the problem of chip smuggling. There was one exchange between a member of Congress and Kessler where, the congressperson said, there are some that deny this smuggling is happening at all. Kessler said, it's happening. It's a fact, which thank goodness he said that. I think that really needs to be better understood by more people, given that there are some companies out there putting out an alternative message that I think does need to be rebutted. But overall, I think what we've got here is a pretty good understanding that the Trump administration still cares about this policy. They still want this policy to work. And I think that really matters if you're looking at these trade negotiations, where there's been statements that because of China's export controls on rare earths, these specialized metals that are important to manufacturing in so many industries, that maybe as part of the grand bargain between the United States and China, the United States would get rid of its AI chip export controls in exchange for China getting rid of its rare earth export controls. I think they didn't answer it explicitly, but my assessment is that is not going to happen. I don't think that's consistent with what Kessler has articulated here. I think there's some parts of the story that might be rolled back, like export controls on, EDA software, and we've seen reporting that was like rolled back somewhat after the Geneva negotiations and the subsequent negotiations in London. But overall, I think the Trump administration, is sort of settling at this overall point here, which is they're going to continue with the policy in a modified form. That 200,000 chip figure, which again is for 2025, we're halfway through 2025. Huawei is going to continue making progress. Leonard Heim, who's a friend of mine and doing good work over at the Rand Corporation, he put out a pretty interesting analysis out on X, which was, if China produces 200,000 Ascend 910Cs annually, filling the UAE's planned 5 gigawatt data center would require 15 years of production for 3.1 million chips while delivering only half the performance. So, and to match performance, they would have to have 7 million chips consuming 2.2 times more energy. So the basic point here is like, one of the things that we're, hearing in the discourse on AI chip export controls is, we need to sell abroad to prevent China from backfilling us. I do think that is a concern that should be on policymakers' mind, but just in terms of where we are in the story in 2025, Huawei's level of production right now does not put them in a position to credibly backfill. I mean, that could change, in 3 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, but at least for right now, they're not in a position to.
And it's something
backfill.
You'll be watching and others will be watching.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now let's talk about Meta and the new Superintelligence Lab. Last week, New York Times wrote about Meta's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg's plan to build an AI superintelligence lab that's led by Scale AI CEO Alexander Wang. Meta is reportedly investing $15 billion in Scale AI and offering up to 9-figure salaries to recruit staff from other AI labs. They're out there poaching. Why is Meta spending billions on this initiative? And I think I know the answer to this, but I really want to know what you think.
Yeah, well, first, I just got to, promote the fact that we had former Scale AI CEO Alexander Wang here at CSIS. I got the chance to interview him.
Yes.
If you haven't listened to that event, it's on YouTube. We actually re-released a version of it on this podcast. And you should definitely listen to it. He's a very smart, very interesting guy. And the fact that Meta is, I think... I've seen it reported as an acquire hire, so it's close to an acquisition of the company, although it doesn't technically meet that threshold because they only bought 49% of the company. But Alexander Wang has now left Scale AI as CEO. He's going to go lead the Superintelligence Lab at Meta. And presumably, I don't know this for a fact, but presumably he still has some meaningful ownership of Scale AI shares. So, they have what they need to do what they want. I think this is really coming about the really accelerating pace of competition. One thing that I think is really important is this report from Business Insider that said in May that, Meta's best family of large language models is called Llama, which is an open source thing. And on that first Llama paper that came out in 2023, which was a landmark, there were 14 authors. only 3 still work at Meta, right? So a lot of their best talent, has left the company. They feel this very ferocious competition for talent. One of the ways that they're looking to improve that is by acquire hiring, making this new transaction with Scale AI and bringing on Alexander Wang. And then another thing that they're doing is, again, according to reporting out there, Mark Zuckerberg is personally calling people and offering them, what was it, like 9-figure salaries. So that's like ballpark $10 million. Wow, is there a lot of money, right, going after the best talent in this field? And that's because of the moment we're at. Just last week, Sam Altman, OpenAI's CEO, published a new blog that said, quote, "We are past the event horizon. The takeoff has started. Humanity is close to building digital superintelligence." So we're talking AIs that are not just, useful in doing your work. We're talking AIs that are like smarter than Albert Einstein by a lot at everything. That's where these companies assess themselves to be in the AI innovation story. And they think winning this competition, just like, Congress and the White House and the Department of Defense think it really matters in the US versus China competition. Companies like Meta, companies like Google, companies like OpenAI, they're assessing that this one's for all the marbles, folks. And they need to be willing to make jaw-dropping bets to go after it. I mean, just thinking about like the size of this acquisition, $19 billion. $15 billion. Remember the CHIPS Act, right? The CHIPS Act, which was supposed to be a once-in-a-generation investment, according to then Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, that was $51 billion over 4 years, right? So like just Meta dropping this, chunk of change is larger than the annual spend of the CHIPS Act. So just jaw-dropping amounts of money.
Greg, so when we talk about superintelligence, what do they exactly mean? I mean, you just said smarter than Albert Einstein by a lot. How different is it from AGI or artificial general intelligence? Sometimes we think of this stuff as science fiction. Maybe too often we think of it as science fiction. But when people like Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg are talking about superintelligence, they really mean it. They really believe in it.
Yeah.
Tell me what the distinction is.
So there's not widespread agreement on what these terms mean. Part of the reason why there's not widespread agreement on this is because a lot of money is at stake, depending on what these terms mean. I mean, literally the terms of the OpenAI deal with Microsoft, where Microsoft invested a lot in OpenAI, says that certain things happen in that transaction once a level of artificial general intelligence is reached, right? So like, as soon as there's money on the line, depending on what that word means, you can bet people are going to fight over what that word means. I'll just say that for my part, when you think about, a human being, we're not just very smart at things, we're also incredibly flexibly smart, right? We can be good at chess, we can be good at horseback riding, we can be good at translating languages. So that general intelligence refers to, we're not just some like chess playing supercomputer. We're also an individual that can engage in language, write novels, and do a bunch of other things. So it's that flexible generality. And I think that sort of it's useful. Obviously, there's types of intelligences that humanity is not flexible to understand. We have a really hard time imagining 7-dimensional space, for example. So it's not like we're perfectly generalized, but we're broadly generalized. And so folks like OpenAI, they describe AGI as AI systems that are generally smarter than humans. Now, superintelligence is when we're not just generally smarter than humans, we're smarter than the smartest humans who have ever lived in basically every category of intelligence that humans have ever been good at. And note that, in that quote I read earlier from the Sam Altman blog post, he talked about the word event horizon. And the point here is that one of the things that AIs and superintelligent AIs could be good at is AI research and making AIs ever smarter, ever more capable, et cetera. And so there's this, hypothesis out there that's very widely believed in the AI community, right? That we could have something that is as smart as Albert Einstein one year, and then have something that's 10 times smarter than Albert Einstein the next year, and then have something that's 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times smarter than Albert Einstein after that. So that's what that takeoff kind of whoa scenario is for AI. And that's really the story that is really tied up with that word superintelligence. So you can understand why companies are willing to make big strategic moves. And it's worth pointing out that there's been, some strategic responses. So Scale AI was, in some ways, they kind of occupied the same role in the ecosystem for AI. This is not a perfect analogy, but, the same role that AWS occupied in computing. So Amazon has Prime Video, for example. So, you can go watch movies on Amazon Prime Video streaming. But AWS is a cloud computing provider, and one of their largest customers is Netflix. So literally, Netflix is a competitor of Amazon, but they're also a customer of Amazon. And Scale AI, because so many other firms like Meta, like OpenAI, like xAI, like Google, were all customers of Scale AI. The fact that Meta is now in the driver's seat for what Scale AI is doing is causing, what Time Magazine is calling like a flurry of deal-making activity. We've already heard that Google plans to cut ties with Scale AI. xAI plans to cut ties with Scale AI. So they're no longer comfortable being both a customer and a competitor of Scale AI, given its new relationship with Meta. And then just think about that for 1 second, right? Meta had to anticipate that this was going to happen. They knew that this was going to happen. So that means when they decided that 49% of Scale AI was worth $15 billion, that was even after they took into account the fact that they were about to lose many of their biggest customers. It's just a remarkable time.
It's remarkable. Well, we can do a whole podcast on superintelligence, and we will in the days to come. Greg, thanks so much for all this today. Great insight as always. We will be back in a couple weeks with another great episode of the AI Policy Podcast.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.